Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Father Ted Talks. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about, the famous event in the Old Testament, which had to do with Abraham's sacrifice. If you guys remember the story, right? Abraham, who is the father of the Israel nation, he at some point in his life, when he had his son Isaac, he was, brought, he was brought into the wilderness, away from his home, to a new land, and he was called by God for this adventure to be able to follow him and to create a covenant with him, a relationship with him, and that all his seed, all his descendants after him would, be God's people, which became the nation of Israel, which became, the people of the Old Testament that we kind of hear about. And so we see that Abraham, at one point, he's asked by God to do a very, very strange thing that often scandalizes people today. And that is when he is asked by God to sacrifice his son Isaac, right? So he says, you're going to go up to the mountain, you're going to build an altar, and instead of sacrificing a lamb, which is what usually they would do, they would sacrifice an animal to God, you're going to sacrifice your son Isaac to me, right? And so this was a very, very difficult thing for Abraham to do and to accept. And, as the story goes, Abraham took his son up there and he tied him up. And as he was about to, sacrifice his son, of course, God stopped him because God would not allow Abraham to sacrifice his own son. And in the place of Isaac, Abraham saw a lamb that was provided by God to be able to do the proper sacrifice. And so it was almost like God was testing him. And a lot of people say, well, why would God ever do that? Why would God ever ask a human being to sacrifice their own son? This seems like an insane thing to do. It seems like a very kind of mean God, an unreasonable God, to ask Abraham to give up his only son, the one that he had prayed for many, many years with his wife Sarah to have, right, the miracle son. And yet, when we think about it, there are two things that we can kind of take away from this. There's of course, there is the main parallel, which is of course Christ, right? Because where God did not allow Abraham to sacrifice his own son, God the Father does in the New Testament sacrifice his own son, Christ, for the life of the world, right? And so where God does not allow mankind to kind of make that ultimate sacrifice, God himself, because he loves us so much, is willing to make that sacrifice when it's the proper time. So, of course, God puts his money where his mouth is. He does the thing that he doesn't let Abraham do. He did test Abraham's faith, but he didn't allow him to actually go through with it, whereas God actually sacrificed his own son. That's kind of like the main, parallel that happens between the Old Testament and the New Testament. But what I want to talk about today is a little bit more on a practical note about how this story relates to raising our children. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, this story is really, really interesting because we live in a time where we've heard the term, helicopter parents. Parents today coddle their children. They don't let them even fall down and scrape their knees. They want to make sure that their children are comfortable, and they have all the conveniences, and they have the latest iPhone, and they have the nicest iPad, and we don't want them to have any hardships, or especially they didn't want to have the hardships that they had when the parents had when they were kids, right? And so kids today, we feel that if we are protecting them from the adversities of life, then we are actually helping them. But the reality is that we are not. Time and time again, different psychological and sociological studies have shown that we are actually doing harm to our children by not allowing them to face the danger of life. Children need to be able to learn how to build resilience. And this is really important, resilience, how to overcome difficulties on their own, be able to learn how to cope on their own without any help. And this is something that the parent needs to do by slowly exposing children to limited amounts of danger, and this is painful for a child, for a parent, because a parent seeing their child suffer, nobody wants to see their child suffer. Nobody wants their child to go through difficulties. And yet, these are the things that actually make them stronger. If a child has never gone through any difficulties, then when they get older and life inevitably will bring calamities and catastrophes upon them, they won't have the skill set and the strength to be able to deal with them. And so bottom line is that when we look at the example of Abraham, who understands that, obedience to God and love of God is the number one thing in life, even over the love of your wife and your children. Not to say that you're choosing God over your wife and your children, but rather that God is the number one priority, and then it is the nuclear family, and everything has to be dedicated to God first. And this kind of faith that we're supposed to have in God, that he knows best, has to be absolute, right? And so if we place all our faith in God, then it shows that God will help us and will never leave us and will never allow us to fall beyond any type of redemption, right? And so we see that the story of Abraham, if you really kind of take it from a moral kind of example of how to raise our children, we see that you have to really be willing to let your kid face death, right? To let go if you want your child to actually live. Now, I'm not saying you want to kill your kid like Abraham was told to kill his son, to sacrifice his son. I'm not saying that like literally, but rather this idea that you have to be willing to give up your child and let the world kind of like, challenge them. And even with the danger of negative things happening, if you want your child to grow, if you want to get your child back, if you want your child to grow up respecting you and God and the world that they live in, right? So we're not doing our children any favors by not allowing them to scrape their knee, not allowing them to kind of, lose that job when they don't show up on time to work, not allowing them to fail that test when they don't study for it, instead of, filling in the answers for them, or, helping them with that assignment where they could have done it themselves, but, we do it for them because we want them to get a good mark. Well, we're not doing them any favors by doing these things. Rather, we are crippling them for life, both emotionally and even many times psychologically, so that they will not be able to deal with with what life has to offer to them. And so, this story of Abraham always reminds me that with my children, I have 3 children, I have to let them make their mistakes. As painful as it is, I have to let them fail sometimes so that they can get themselves back up again and learn how to be resilient, learn how to overcome, so they can be stronger and independent as they grow, become their own human beings. So this is just something that the story of Abraham reminds me of. It's a different take on it than a lot of times when we think of what it is. It's not just a test of faith by God, but rather also a teaching moment for us as parents. How do we treat our kids? Do we show them that God is first? Do we show them that sacrifice is really, really important? And do we show them that we have to be willing to give up everything for God, even our lives? Because this is what Christ does for us, and this is what the early Christian martyrs did, and this is what many, many Christian martyrs even to this day do for the Lord. We have to be willing to do that as well, as crazy as that sounds in our modern day. So that's all I had to say about that today. Till next time, take care and God bless.